It was often played outside, so daylight. There would be musicians walking, so there would be parades. Marching brass bands or string groups would sit outside, or society orchestras. Also, it was an important part of celebration, but also of funerals. So you can, perhaps you have seen these funeral parades, and there's this thing called second lining, and second lining is basically the parade that accompanies the funeral parade, and it's the musicians and their umbrellas, and they're slowly walking the streets and basically celebrating the life of the deceased. So that's something called second lining. So there was also a lot of improvisation, and it's still a practice today, a very important practice. So it's not that this completely is gone, but it was added with, let's say, another aspect of being a musician was that people started to earn a living. So especially after the abolishment of slavery, it was people with an African American background who found jobs in these poorer neighborhoods in Storyville, and so they became professional musicians. They would be playing at night. They would sit. So also then what happens is, for example, the double bass makes an entrance into the jazz ensemble. It was part of it, but not as much. Like when you walk, it's easy to have a tuba, for example, to play the bass parts than a double bass. So it moved also partly indoors. And there was another phenomenon of people drawing audiences to your specific venue, and that was called ballyhooing. So ballyhoo would be if you would stand in the theater on the balcony and play and try to attract people, but it would also there would also be battles between different orchestras or bands that would perform in different theaters. So there were all kinds of ways of attracting audiences. In the Netherlands, you see this on the parade, which is an annual, or used to be an annual festivity in different cities. Perhaps some of you have been there or know it, where the people have to draw audiences inside by doing a little act outside. Another way of ballyhooing was that the band would be on a truck and move throughout the city and draw attention to people like that. So there was a transition in musicianship, or maybe an addition in musicianship, where there was an increase of professional musicians improvising in these brothels or casinos or theaters, where they had to accompany and play all night long. Okay, as said, I have made another assignment with listening examples I'm going to tell you more about after this class. And one of the examples I want you to listen to is of Pyron's New Orleans Orchestra. This was an orchestra that was active in the 1920s, very popular in New Orleans. And you can say that this particular song can be seen to represent the transition from ragtime to jazz. So what I want you to do is listen to the music, also compare it to the ragtime you've been listening to for the class of last week, and see how it sounds different, and also give the form of this tune. One of the reasons why I want you to listen to the form is also so you realize that it wasn't by any means fixed, as we know it, for example, of standards that emerged and became popular in the 1930s, where you often have an AABA form. This was not the case. It was a mix, and a form of unequal length was pretty much part of the practice. Also, what I want you to realize is that jazz in this time, and will be for quite a while, is very much part of an entertainment. It's a form of entertainment. It's popular music. So people play it in order to earn money, to attract audiences. So always keep in mind what is happening in that music, why, and think of why it would attract audiences in that time. Also, compare it to your life now as a musician. We also, because you play jazz at a conservatory, so it has moved. The status of jazz has moved more towards a form of art, much more than it was in the 1920s. So it was much more associated with low life, entertainment, brothels, gambling, all that sort of stuff. So we will see during this course the transition and how this happened and why also, not just musically, but there were economic and social reasons why this transition took place. As we see now with the transition from ragtime to jazz, from outside playing to inside playing, there was a demand of audiences who wanted to listen to jazz music while they were having fun in the bar. Right, so for next week, you listen to this particular song and answer the question. In the meanwhile, if you have any questions, please ask. And I'm hoping that I can go to the next slide. So I want to give you a name of a couple of musicians. Some of them we will talk about more in further detail, but so you know who I'm talking about when I talk about sort of the first generation of musicians. Buddy Bolden is an important example. We'll talk about him after this. King Oliver was also very important also for the success of Louis Armstrong. So we get to talk about King Oliver in a couple of weeks when we have one class on Louis Armstrong, or Louis Armstrong, I should say. He was playing with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band or Creole Orchestra, depending. Names would be different according to the places they were playing. It reminds me of, I would often go to, a couple of years ago, to the Ferdinand Povel Quartet, and they would play every 2 weeks. And so 1 week it would be called the Ferdinand Povel Quartet. 2 weeks later it would be called the Peter Bates Quartet. Then it would be called the Gijs Dijkhuizen Quartet. And then the week after it would be called after the bass player. But it was the same quartet. So I'm just saying that these names would change a lot. So they were both cornet players. Freddie Keppard was also a cornet player, so that's where the CT stands for, was also active. You will see that quite a few of these musicians at some point also moved to Chicago, where there were more opportunities, job opportunities, and opportunities for playing. Also, when they were based in New Orleans, they were no means fixed in that city, but they would travel around as well and play. A pianist we're going to talk about after this is Jerry Roll Morton. So he was the first known jazz arranger, and also one of his songs was sometimes called the first published jazz song. So we'll get to talk about that after this. Kid Ory and Kid Ory's original Creole Jazz Band was also active trombone player, also important in the career of Louis Armstrong. Sidney Bechet, clarinet, sometimes soprano saxophone, was also active in New Orleans. He was one of the first jazz soloists, because what we will notice, and also please notice when you listen to the music, this was still very much collective playing and collective improvisation. And with the the emerging popularity of Louis Armstrong, we see the emergence of real soloists. So that wasn't really that much part of the early jazz practice. It was mainly collective improvisation. Right, then we have Clarence Williams. He is an interesting person because he was someone who was active not only as a musician, but also as a producer and a programmer. And he was typically one of these examples that used music as a way of social climbing. We talked about this last week, where someone noted, now it's the exact opposite. I've been thinking about this remark. I don't completely agree. I think it means a lot when you're a jazz musician. You have a lot of talents and expertise, not only to play as a musician, but also to contribute to many other aspects of life and business. So, but this is another discussion. Right, so Clarence Williams, he started off polishing shoes. You probably know this image of someone kneeling down and polishing the shoes of some hotshots. That's how he started, and then he ended up owning his own vaudeville theater. So he also played in minstrel shows. We have been talking about minstrel shows last week as well. This was a form of entertainment, variety entertainment, where you would have different types of entertainment, so singing, dancing, a lot of the times blackface as well. So it was white artists who paint their faces with burnt cork usually. Controversial now, of course, obviously very problematic. So he was an example of a successful social climber in music. And then Bunk Johnson is someone who needs to be mentioned as a musician that was also successfully active in minstrel shows, but also playing in circuses and on ocean liner. There might be some of you out there who still play on cruise ships. It's a nice way to see the world, and especially if you're in your early 20s, you do a gig of a couple of weeks or perhaps even a couple of months. There's still a jazz cruise. I think it's called the North Sea Jazz Cruise, with some musicians who that travels the Caribbean. Right. Okay. So these are some musicians that, if you read or listen to them, that you know, okay, they are associated with New Orleans jazz. So one of the two I want to highlight for today is, first of all, Buddy Bolden. He actually features in the documentary by Ken Burns. I've mentioned this before. This documentary, and he is sometimes called as one of these starting points musicians that really played an important role in the establishment of jazz, because he, for example, typifies the transition from playing in string groups to dance groups. He was also a powerful lead cornetist that played largely by ear. So a lot of music was played by ear, but as we have seen last week, there was also a lot of sheet music going on. So this whole idea of people only playing from their heart, that's sort of romanticizing what was happening. So there were professional musicians who really knew how to play and read music. So he was allegedly also the first to bring the explicitly African qualities of flat and blue notes and hot syncopations into the ragtime setting and later in jazz. And as you can see, I've added allegedly after all these things, because there's one problem: we have no recordings. So the interesting thing is, if you ever watch this documentary, and I think you can find this fragment of Wynton Marsalis talking about Buddy Bolden and his 4-beat patterns, which he allegedly introduced, and a way of playing, then you have to remind yourself that there are no recordings, so there's no evidence of this. So it's also partly romanticizing someone and attributing things to one person that might not be. You can't really do that. So it's historically inaccurate. So I'm always be critical. A lot of jazz musicians love to tell stories, and they're great to listen to, but also think, is this historically true? Right. So Buddy Bolden. So he's a kind of mythical figure, let's say, in jazz. Right, another musician I want you to know, you can see him here on the picture, Jerry Roll Morton. Ugh, cold coffee. He was a pianist. As you can see, he was rather lightly. He had a rather light skin color, and sometimes they also say that was one of the reasons that he was such a successful musician. He was rather Spanish looking, so Creole African American descent. He was someone who played from very early on in brothels, really as like 12, 13 years old, in Storyville. He also moved at some quite early on to New Orleans, but he is often identified as a sort of typical New Orleans player. He already left New Orleans in 1907, so quite early, but he would come back quite often as well. So what I want you to do is listen to his music. He's a sort of transitional figure between ragtime and jazz playing as well. So please identify what kind of characteristics you can hear in Wolverine blues. So he was typically one of these musicians that would play all-nighters, so-called all-nighters. So he would play in a brothel, for example, and played long hours, background music, basically. So the type of music was also very suitable with the bass patterns for sort of background music. So you still had that sort of regular rhythm and not too much dynamics, but it was sort of easy to listen to. So in the listening example, I want you to listen to how you would describe the characteristics and the performance of this tune. So you could listen to the sort of melody and the theme, but also how it develops. Right. Yeah. So he was famous for the Jelly Roll Blues in 1915. That was allegedly one of the first printed jazz examples. Here it's called a blues, but we're going to listen to the Wolverine Blues. And as said, he is one of these sort of key figures in the transition from ragtime to jazz. So then we go to what is commonly celebrated as the first jazz recording in 1917. You have probably heard of this by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. There are, of course, some things you have to know about this first jazz recording. First of all, I have been talking a little bit about the industry in the 1920s last week in relation or in connection to blues. And I mentioned that the recording business was mostly white-owned and white-dominated. So the publishers would be white guys. The music industry was orientated very much towards a white middle-class audience. But between the 1920s and 40s, there was also a different market that was being discovered. The African American market, so African American middle class people who wanted to listen to their own sort of music played by African American blues artists. And these were typically called race records. So they were published by so-called race labels. After the Second World War, this term race records was so problematic that they recoined it rhythm and blues. So that would be the catch-all term for music performed by African Americans for an African American market. So I keep on stressing the whole color and race issue because it was so important also for why some people were perhaps more successful than others, also why it was a lot of the times African Americans who would become musicians because it was one of these opportunities to become social climbers. In the Netherlands, you see at some point that people with a darker skin color from the former colonies in the Netherlands, like Suriname, they would become the musicians who made jazz. So there was not necessarily a connection between African Americans playing jazz and Suriname people, but because of the association with the color of their skin, they would end up playing jazz in the red light district in Amsterdam, for example. So you can't tell the story and the history of jazz without mentioning this context. It's really important. Also, there's an element of, let's say, a racial aspect to the success or the release of the first jazz recording. It was a white jazz quintet, and this was a bit odd considering the sort of the predominantly African American amount of musicians that were playing jazz, but this was a white jazz quintet, and so you have to think of who had the authority to record and the money also to record this type of music, and why was this specific recording launched as the first jazz recording, of why did it become known as the first jazz recording? Right, so they were active like African American musicians within the entertainment scene. So they had a regular gig in Chicago in the Casino Gardens. So allegedly, so it's known as the first jazz recording commercially released. And also they played as part of a variety entertainment. Another place for performing jazz was also at picnics, for example. Also the radar boats of the Mississippi boats, you probably know these type of boats. And again, what I want you to think of, because I brought a fragment of the first jazz recording by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, is think again that the context was entertainment. So considering that context, how would you describe the characteristics and the performance of this tune? So what was the main purpose of the music? Was to entertain. How can you make the connection to what is being played and how the music sounds? So what makes it attractive music for audiences at that time? So I will already tell you a little bit that you will find a lot of what we call novelty effects, so noise of animals or imitations of the newest, the latest technological things like steam trains and all that, and honking of automobile honking. So there's all kinds of ways of making these connections between the music, the musical structure, what you hear, and why it was suitable as entertainment music. So this is something I want you to sort of focus on in this particular listening assignment. Okay, so for next week, I'll go to the last slide. So I gave you a listening assignment last week, and not everyone made the assignment, and I really, really want you to do so because I want you to listen to the music. So I want to spend next week discussing the listening examples in more detail, and these are the listening examples of last week and of this week. So I made 2 assignments in Teams. So I have seen that some people submitted already. Some people saw the assignment but did not submit. And then there were the people who did not submit. So if you can't find it, please let me know or ask a fellow student, where is it? So make sure to make that assignment. There are 2 assignments with a couple of songs. And please listen to the music. So where can you find the assignment? In Teams. Go to Jazz History 1, and then you see on top, you see assignments. If you click assignments, then you should be able to see 2 assignments. I have been adding some stuff, so you might get a notification that the assignment has changed. The people who already submitted the first assignment don't have to be nervous. It's just that I added some more information on where to find the musical examples. So no need to go back if you have already submitted. Also, please submit the answers as an attachment in the assignment. So don't send it to me via email or via the chat, but really do. I think it speaks for itself because a lot of you have done this successfully. So again, if you don't know how to do it, please ask a fellow student or email me if it's a problem. So if you cannot open PowerPoint, then please check the following link. This is where I have all the music that I discuss organized of this the first semester. So also for the people who are able to open the PowerPoint, you can also go to this playlist on Spotify to listen to the music. I have added for the second assignment also a PDF of my slides. I will do that with the first assignment as well, so you know which slides I'm talking about. So then you should be all sorted. There should be no problems, hopefully. And then please note, if you do not submit the assignments, you cannot make the exam. I do this because I really want to encourage you to listen to the music. Right. Are there any questions or people who had problems? Because we're here now together as a group, so we might be able to solve it immediately. Is there anyone who has problems or had problems finding the assignment? Okay, guess not. Are there any questions about today's class, about early jazz? We will continue to discuss the music structural elements next week based on the listening example. So I gave you a lot of context now. And I think it's important to know this context also because I'd like to encourage you to think about your own context. So also think, where's the money? Where are my opportunities? What we see now is much more that you have to create them yourself. Think of great projects, develop them, and try to go to concert halls or ask funding applications in the Netherlands. That's one of the most common ways of getting your music played other than at jam sessions or bars or whatever. So really think, what are my opportunities? How does my music travel? So here we have recordings and we have live performance. You have other options, of course. You don't necessarily need a label to produce your music, which was it's not as expensive now to make a little recording as it was, depending on what type of quality you want, of course. So it's such a different world. It's no longer only entertainment, but there are some musicians, jazz musicians, who really make a bit more connection to this type of past, and then there are musicians that choose to connect more, for example, with and play with classical musicians. So there are all kinds ways of using your knowledge of jazz and the tradition of jazz in your own practice. Right. If there are no questions or stories you want to tell about New Orleans, then I suggest we call it a day. So make the assignments, and then next week we are going to discuss the tunes more on music structural level. Okay, last comments. Please, if you haven't done so already, say hi. You don't have to do it twice. Just say it once is fine. So I know you were there. And if you have any problems with the assignments, please let me know. All right. I wish you mentally a very sunny week, because it's so rainy outside. And I see you again next week. So check Azimuth. I think it will stay the same this time, but I'm not quite sure. So please check Azimuth for the times and schedule of the jazz history class next week. All right. I'm going to stick here and go through your names in the chat. And I see you all next week. Bye.